welcome to the January 23rd, 2024 Eugene Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Definitely tell my mic is working now. My name is Tiffany Edwards, and I am the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. To begin this evening, I'd like to call on Commissioner Bailing for the city's land acknowledgement statement.
Since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards to our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as Kalapuya Ilahe. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederate Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
Hey, thank you, Commissioner Bailing, and thanks to everyone joining us in this virtual meeting format. Today, our meeting will begin with a brief discussion and a vote on a letter to Council on the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Adoption Package, followed by an informational work session on the recently completed climate-friendly areas study. Excuse me. Anyone wishing to join the meeting online can do so by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or on the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21. So the first item on the agenda today is a work session review recommendation memo to Council for the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan Adoption Package. And for this agenda item, I am going to turn it over to Terry Harding.
Thank you, Commissioner Edwards. Good evening. My name is Terry Harding. I'm the Principal Planner for Community Planning and Design with the City of Eugene. And we're at the conclusion of the Planning Commission's role in the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan process. So congratulations. The Planning Commission, as a reminder, finished their deliberations on December 5th of 2023 and directed staff to prepare a letter describing that recommendation, which we have done and attached to your packet. So for tonight, we're going to discuss this letter, take any suggested changes from commissioners. I have the letter up on the screen so we can hopefully be efficient with our process. And then we have a couple of suggested motions once you agree on the letter to cause it to be delivered to the City Council. And that's the summary.
Okay. I'm going to open up the floor to any commissioners that have any comments on the letter, any suggested edits, motion, however. Mr. Bailing, go ahead.
At the December 5th meeting, we discussed whether or not to repeal the 1987 River Road Santa Clara Urban Facilities Plan and decided not to, since the neighborhood plan is neither a land use plan nor a refinement. Since the repeal was one of the original adoption package components, I wonder if that information should be included in this memo.
Yeah, it certainly could be. You could add that, no problem.
Okay. Any other comments or response to Commissioner Bailing's suggestion? Go ahead, Commissioner Beeson.
I like your suggestion. I have one I guess what I call kind of a substantive suggested edit. I think overall I'm okay with it and moving it forward. In the fourth paragraph, the second sentence, kind of in its entirety, where staff proposed the set of changes early 2023, in large part in response to changes in state law. And then it's called out to emphasize housing production and equitable outcomes of planning work. The code amendments to me to reduce the maximum height in C2 and to prohibit certain uses in C2, and then a few other things that are sort of related to that. I don't see any connection between housing production and equitable outcomes of planning. I've read that a number of times and I'm maybe missing something. For me, it would still work if the entire sentence was just taken out and you just go right straight to the third sentence and insert something about, as proposed by staff in early 2023. In the third sentence, you say that basically the changes that are brought forward by staff reflect the most, I've kind of always understood it, the most important issues that came out of all the neighborhood work. So it never occurred to me that what we're proposing to change in C2 had to do with housing production.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'll stop there. It just,
Yeah, no,
it doesn't click.
A good suggestion. I'll just make a short comment, which is I was trying to do a lot with that one sentence and kind of encompass the requirements of climate-friendly, equitable communities work on our shift in our overall work program.
Okay.
So it wasn't meant to describe the intent of the neighborhood-specific code amendments themselves, but more the reasoning for shifting away from the special area zone. But I think it works without that sentence.
Commissioner Beeson, I agree. I actually, it didn't occur to me as I was reading this that you all are well aware that I did not support the plan for those reasons. And so I do kind of find it a bit, it's a contradiction, slightly a contradiction to me that where we're saying that, out of, I'm sorry, I can't read it without putting these glasses on. That we're emphasizing housing production, but yet one of the recommendations that we are putting forward as a commission was actually reducing the capacity for housing because of the zoning, the height reduction. So I'll leave it at that. I want to add one other component to the discussion. As you all know, like I said, I didn't support this, and I know I was the lone wolf here, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. But I also wanted to consider having somebody else be the person to go to council and read the letter if that's what the commission decides to do. And I would be very open to having somebody else who was a yes vote on the package to step up and maybe do that. So I'm happy to do it if you all would like that, but I also would be very comfortable with someone who could speak to the overall recommendations that supported them, which because I did. Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest Commissioner Ramey.
Oh.
That's the hazard of making eye contact. I actually saw that. I thought that was a little curious. And there's two ways to think about this. One is that the idea of a commission is that you make a motion and then your leader takes that direction to the council. Because that sort of sends a message that, well, we maybe didn't agree, but this is where we ended. I think if you pick out the winners and send them, you're saying, well, this is the winners. So to me, there was actually some logic in having a minority propose it, someone who was on the minority side rather than, but to me, that it's most logical to have the chair or the co-chair take forward the item rather than the winner or the loser,
See how he did that? He just
to me.
it off. No,
Eye contact.
I'll just
Like that.
respond in saying, thank you, Commissioner Ramey. I will respond saying, I'm perfectly comfortable. I just wanted to put that out there in case you all felt that it seemed inappropriate. Oh, Commissioner Isaacson has his hand up. Thank you.
I was just gonna say if Commissioner Edwards if that wasn't the selection, that it should fall to our vice chair and go in order of our leadership.
Commissioner Beeson.
Yeah, I kind of want to echo Commissioner Ramey. I mean, there were 3 of us who voted against the code amendments. There were all, I'm telling you all things you know, but there were two motions. The plan and the Metro Plan amendments were all supported unanimously by the entire commission. So I found myself kind of thinking it would be good to go ahead and just have the chair do it. And I appreciate, what Commissioner Edwards was saying too. I think I'm generally okay with whoever the commission says they would like to do it, but I kind of like the idea of the chair delivering. It's a planning commission memo to the council. So.
Okay. Well, let me just say then, there is a motion that was sent to us. So if anybody wants to read it, the commissioner is left as a blank. So feel free, if you would like to make a motion, I would entertain one from any of you, pending no further discussion or changes, recommendations. You can fill in the blank.
Are we supposed to pick which one of those two?
Before we get there,
Okay.
I would ask Commissioner Edwards if we could do a straw poll or a head nod on the letter, on the changes to the
Sure.
letter. Showing on the screen. And I think the way we could do this is if we have general agreement, I could work with the chair or whoever's picked to deliver the letter to make sure that it's done how you want it. But I will. There's an earlier one. First, I struck the sentence that Ken suggested we strike. So that was the sentence that said staff proposed this set of code changes in early 2023, in large part to respond to changes in state law, which emphasize housing production and equitable outcomes of planning work across the state. So we would take that out and then add somewhere, maybe here, near the bottom, a sentence or two about the original proposal to repeal the 1987 plan and the commission's discussion and ultimate decision to not repeal it, keep it in place alongside the new neighborhood plan. This is kind of a clunky sentence, but I wrote, the commission also considered repealing the 1987 River Road Santa Clara Urban Facilities Plan and replacing it with the new neighborhood plan. Based on testimony and staff analysis of the purpose of the two plans, the commission decided to keep the 1987 plan in place alongside the new neighborhood plan. Probably be made a little bit more eloquent, but I could wordsmith it with the selected commissioner. Are there head nods on those two changes to the letter? Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. All right, we're good with those changes, and whoever whether it's myself or anybody else who would like to make a motion and appoint somebody to deliver these remarks to council would be working with Terry to fine tune everything. And I think we have a couple motions that Terry's even put up there. It would be both motions, right, Terry?
Yeah, so both motions could be, would be filled with the same name. Someone wants to make a motion.
Well, I will.
Commissioner
I'll make a motion that we authorize Commissioner Edwards to sign the letter and cause it to be delivered, and also to appear and speak on behalf of the commission.
Sorry, there a second?
Second.
I got Commissioner Bailing before Commissioner Isaacson jumped in. So I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, I'll call for the vote. All of those in favor, you can raise your hand. I can see you all here and, okay, perfect. Any opposed or, okay, so it's unanimous. Great. And now we have a second motion, if anyone would like to move that forward.
Well, I was.
Combined them.
I kind
Oh,
of.
you did? Oh my gosh, I apologize.
All right.
That's okay. He combined them. I think we're all good.
Okay,
We've authorized you to do both things.
Just
It's the glasses going back and forth.
I know.
I can't see
It's so
this
hard.
with them, but I can't see this without them, so.
I think I should stop sharing. I think we're done with this item.
Okay, well, let's move on then. We're
Okay,
gonna
thank
move
you
on
very
to the
much.
next item, which is our work session on the climate friendly areas study overview. And we've got Leah Roush here to walk us through that. So
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Edwards, and thanks, commissioners, for having me. My name is Leah Roush, and I'm an associate planner with Community Planning and Design and was the project manager for the climate friendly areas study. So I will just apologize in advance that this is going to be a meaty presentation. The study was meaty, and there's a lot to get into. So excited to share this with you all as our kind of first run at the information on climate friendly areas, but knowing that there will be many follow-up conversations. So as you all know, staff have been working to implement the climate friendly and equitable communities or CFAC rules for the last year and a half now. CFAC is a state-directed effort to meet Oregon's climate action goals through changes to our local transportation and land use planning systems. So we in Eugene are working to align the requirements of CFAC with the city's existing climate action, housing production, and transportation projects. We're going to focus, as I said today, on just one aspect of CFAC implementation, which is the designation of climate-friendly areas. We'll start the presentation with a quick refresher on CFAC itself, followed by an overview of the approach that we use to complete Eugene's study of climate-friendly areas. And then we'll share a study of the 9 what are called suitable areas identified and evaluated in the study. And I'll define exactly what it means to be suitable a little bit later on. And then I'll share some results from our analysis of potential housing displacement from CFAs. And I'll just note, and I'll probably note this a couple of times, that the study itself does not recommend which CFAs should be designated. This will really be the next step in our process. Our session today is going to be a starting point for this conversation. It's an opportunity for you all as the Planning Commission to understand the context of CFA designation. We'll spend some time talking about the next steps that will get us towards that final set of recommended CFAs, including community engagement, further technical and policy analysis, and exploration of exactly how we'll implement that designation. So just as a refresher, so I mentioned that the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Program provides really another opportunity to advance our climate action, housing production, and transportation goals locally in alignment with the state requirements. CFAC came about through executive order. Governor Brown directed state agencies to promote cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and less driving, while also centering the needs of Oregon's most vulnerable communities. Following that, the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted the CFAC rules in July of 2022, which require changes to how we do transportation and housing planning within our metro areas. Both in Eugene and at the state, we're working to advance solutions that both reduce our emissions and help to address our current housing crisis, and really see those goals as inextricably linked. So implementation of those CFAC requirements will fall into 4 big buckets. So the first was parking reform. That was completed at the end of 2023 when the city lifted all minimum off-street parking requirements for new development and redevelopment, as well as requiring more infrastructure for electric vehicles, as was recommended by you all as the Planning Commission. Next up in kind of our process is, of course, the designation of climate-friendly areas. And there's also ongoing work led by the city's transportation planning team. So the climate-friendly transportation kind of bucket includes updates to our transportation system plan, implementing a preferred scenario plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and updating our bike parking requirements. The final bucket, which will take up in a couple of years, is compact development, which includes updating the land use code to implement pedestrian-friendly and compact development standards. Attachment A of your agenda packet is just a short summary on updates from some of those other implementation projects. So with all that background in mind, we'll spend the rest of our time talking about the climate-friendly areas study. So as again, a reminder, what is a CFA? A climate-friendly area is intended to be an area where most people can meet their daily needs without relying on a car. So they're urban mixed-use areas that contain or are planned to contain a mix of high-density housing, jobs, businesses, and services. These areas are served or are planned to be served by high-quality walking, biking, and transit infrastructure. So by designating a CFA, Eugene will update our housing and transportation plans for these areas to have opportunities for increased development where people can live, work, shop, and play in that area. Identified and prioritized improvements that make it easier and safer for people to walk and bike and take the bus. And as well as implementing strategies to avoid or minimize displacement of residents that might be vulnerable to housing instability or housing discrimination, as well as preserving and increasing affordable housing options. So our process to actually designate these CFAs has 3 steps. So first is the study, of course. So that's what we spent our time on in 2023, identifying and studying the most promising locations for climate-friendly areas across the city. I'll go through kind of the components of the study in more detail in our presentation today, but the work, in addition to the technical analysis, also included our community engagement approach and the displacement risk analysis. The second step, which we'll start this year, is to actually select our climate-friendly areas. So that process will include going out and doing community engagement, soliciting a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and getting direction from City Council. Adoption of the selected CFAs will require amendments to the Land Use Code and to the Comprehensive Plan. And our community engagement to get to those kind of recommended CFAs will be a part of the community engagement plan for our upcoming or now launched urban growth strategies work, which will really look at housing needs, production strategies, and displacement concerns holistically across the city. So staff will be back on February 13th, which I think is your next meeting, to present that engagement plan for your feedback and approval. So we'll get into all those details next month. So finally, we'll monitor and potentially increase our CFAs over time. So it's not intended to be a static designation. It'll function as one of our land use efficiency measures, which is a strategy for more compact development within our current urban growth boundary. Each time we revisit the urban growth boundary, which we're now required to do every 8 years for housing needs, we'll also revisit our designated climate-friendly areas. When we revisit them, we are required to maintain a threshold that there is zoned capacity to accommodate 30% of our current and future housing needs within designated CFAs. We can talk more about exactly what that zoned capacity means, but there is kind of a benchmark that we'll have to maintain or exceed. So with all that, we'll get into the study itself. We chose to use kind of a narrowing process or a narrowing approach to the study, which involved looking first citywide at all of our potential locations that could serve as CFAs, and then narrowing to our top candidates through kind of an iterative process based on the criteria and the rules. I'll give a quick summary of the approach here, but we'll go through each of the stages in some more detail. So our first step was to cast a wide net. At this stage, our potential CFAs consider where our urban centers exist or planned based on zoning within the UGB, where we have high quality transit access, and areas where development is allowed based on our Goal 7 protections. The second stage was a couple of different kind of parallel analyses, which included really narrowing to our suitable areas based on the state's some key criteria from the state. So we looked at really assessing how far each of the areas got us towards achieving that 30% far for the housing goals, and then evaluating each of the areas based on some of the other criteria that were recommended and required in the rules. This stage also included the anti-displacement analysis, which helped us to understand how CFA designation could increase displacement pressures and what tools we can employ to actually mitigate or avoid that risk. And then the final stage, so the CFA study itself, is a summary of all of that technical analysis and our process through it. The study, as I said, doesn't include that final preferred CFA configuration, but really is an evaluation of our most promising areas based on these narrowing criteria. We submitted the study to the Department of Land Conservation and Development at the end of December, and it's in your meeting materials as attachment B. Okay, so that was the high level. We're going to go deeper now. So the first stage of the analysis is really that citywide scan for potential locations. We looked at, again, existing or planned urban centers. So looking at places like downtown, neighborhood centers, our transit corridors, and we picked 13 base zones and special area zones that are in closer alignment with CFA criteria to start. We also looked at high quality transit. So that's defined as a half-a-mile walking distance from a frequent transit line, which is defined elsewhere in the CFAC rules as 4 stops an hour during peak hours. It's important to note for this, and this will come up later, that this really limits the definition of transit to current service rather than planned kind of future improvements to service. I mentioned goal 7, so that is natural hazards and disasters, natural disasters and hazards. And so the rules require that CFAs can't be located in areas where development is prohibited under that rule, unless the local government has requirements in place to mitigate that potential hazard to life and property. So because in Eugene, we allow development in most areas with proper mitigation strategies, including on steep slopes and in the floodplain, the only thing we excluded from the analysis was the FEMA floodway, which is really right on the floodplain. And that's the only thing that's considered not developable in the analysis. And then within the urban growth boundary, CFAs are allowed in the UGB, but outside of city limits, subject to some additional conditions. We are primarily considering CFA locations within city limits, but there are a few kind of parcels of that urbanizable land included kind of adjacent to CFAs where it's appropriate. So this map shows those four criteria assessed in GIS overlaid together. And so you can see the areas in red are those urban centers by zoning, and the purple is areas within a half-a-mile of a frequent transit line. When we put those all together, this is the map that shows that big citywide scan of all of our potential areas based on those initial factors. Our second stage was to narrow to kind of suitable areas based on size. So Eugene is required to designate at least one climate-friendly area with a minimum of 25 acres, which includes the most intensive development standards required. We also have the option to designate additional secondary climate-friendly areas that can be designated at less intensive development standards. But an important part of identifying these areas is that we're looking for contiguous areas with distinct land use requirements. They have to meet a minimum width of 750 feet. We found some gray area in the rule for how that minimum width is defined. So through discussions with the state, with our peers, with LCOG, who ran the technical analysis, we actually came up with 2 different definitions, either suitable width or kind of a more optimal width as defined by DLCD. So the width, while it's a nuance, is important because we've identified several of our transit corridors as suitable CFA locations, which tend to be a little bit more narrow, although it's in alignment with our Envision Eugene community vision. So this map shows the results of both of those methods citywide. So areas in yellow are potential CFA locations that don't meet either criterion. They're just not big enough or wide enough, so they're non-suitable at this stage. The orange areas are potential locations that meet the kind of minimum suitable width. And the brown areas are potential locations that meet that most optimal definition. So we did choose to retain both the optimal and the suitable locations, and those are kind of subsequently referred to as our suitable CFAs. So after going through all that process, we come to kind of 9 large areas through those narrowing stages. And as you can see, there's a lot of alignment with our community vision for key transit corridors and core commercial areas, and they're relatively well distributed across the city. So now I want to go through each of those 9 areas and talk through some of the additional evaluation criteria that's either required in the CFAC rules or otherwise recommended by DLCD. So these are the criteria that we use to assess how promising each location was. So displacement risk we'll go through in more detail towards the end of the presentation. Development regulation compliance really looks at, does the area zoning comply or can it be brought into compliance with the land use requirements for CFAs? Dwelling unit capacity really gets at that 30% bar that I talked about. So does the area zoning, or as a CFA, its future zoning, can it achieve that zoned residential building and dwelling unit capacity that's required for CFAs? And that's regardless of current development. So wiping kind of the slate clean, what is the zoned capacity for that area? We're looking for high density mixed use areas. So is it the area within or near areas that are planned for or provided with high density residential uses and a high concentration of employment? We're looking for, does the area contain or is it near sufficient parks and other public amenities? And would it be appropriate to site facilities providing public services within that area? Is the area served or planned to be served by high quality walking and biking infrastructure? Can the area's power, stormwater, water, and wastewater infrastructure support the land use requirements for CFAs? And can we expect the area to redevelop or develop at a level that will support our housing production and employment goals? I'm not going to go through each of these kind of 9 criteria in the same level of detail today. I want to focus on the development regulation compliance, and I'll share some highlights from the study for each of the 9 areas. Then we'll end with kind of a snapshot of how the 9 areas compare to each other based on these criteria. So the suitable CFAs, so the 9 areas stretch across 13 base zones and special area zones, as I mentioned, and they each have distinct land use requirements. So the compliance evaluation considers the existing zoning and development regulations and the changes needed to bring it into compliance with CFA standards. The study focuses on a couple of the most meaningful development regulations, but they're not the only regulations in the rules. So the first one we looked at was outright permitted uses. So climate-friendly areas must allow both single-use and mixed-use developments, as well as certain outright permitted uses, including multi-unit and attached single-unit residential, office-type uses, non-auto dependent retail services and other commercial uses, childcare, schools, and other public uses, including public serving government facilities. And for the purposes of this evaluation, any development that requires approval through a land use application process, so that could be a site review, a planned unit development, a conditional use permit, those would all be not considered outright permitted, right? So that's not outright because there's a step in the process. The other most relevant development standards relate to minimum densities and building heights. The study relies on the prescriptive standards presented in the CFAC rules, which require and encourage the following CFA designations. So I talked about the primary CFA, we need at least one, and that'll need a minimum residential density of 25 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 85 feet throughout. We have the option to designate those secondary climate-friendly areas, which can have less intensive standards of 15 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 50 feet throughout. So for the purposes of the rest of the presentation, we'll focus on the primary standards, but just know that secondary, it will be an option for us. So first I want to look at our commercial zones. Because they allow so many uses, including fully residential development. C2, our community commercial zone, and C3, major commercial, are really compliant with CFA for both the permitted uses and for the minimum required building heights. A notable change in C3, which is mostly in downtown, there's a little bit out on 13th by the university, is that they would need to allow single unit attached development as long as it met those minimum residential densities. C1, which is neighborhood commercial, and general office, are moderately compliant. They both require increased maximum allowed building heights. And then some existing commercially zoned land also has those site review or planned unit development overlays, which where they exist makes those outright permitted uses no longer outright permitted. So it reduces compliance where those exist. All of our commercial zones, in order to be CFA compliant, would need minimum residential densities. So this is only applicable for 100% residential development and not for mixed use development, which is an important distinction. As I'm sure is fresh in your memories, Planning Commission recently recommended a reduced height limit in C2 in the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood. And so this reduced height, if adopted, is still compliant with secondary CFA criteria, which is something that we discussed during the code amendment process. Looking at our residential zones, we looked just at R3 and R4, which are our higher density residential zones. Both are less compliant than our commercial zones, mostly because of those outright permitted uses. To be a CFA compliant, the zones would need to allow office type uses and non-auto oriented commercial and retail services, schools, and childcare facilities. Some of these are currently allowed in the residential zones, but they require a site review, a planned unit development, or a conditional use permit. Additionally, R3 has some height limitation areas, including south of UO, which would require an increase in maximum allowed building heights in those areas. Our residential zones do have minimum and maximum densities in place, and so we would need to increase the minimum densities in both R3 and R4, as well as remove the maximum densities. Finally, we looked at our special area zones. So we looked at 7 of the special area zones, and I'll just briefly note that they kind of range in terms of their compliance. Some of these also have sub areas or sub zones, and those also range in their compliance. Downtown Riverfront and Walnut Station specifically have height regulating areas, which kind of vary in terms of whether they comply or not with CFA's standards. Most of these special area zones would need minimum residential densities. They might need to add some outright permitted uses, as well as adjust those height standards. I can touch a little bit on some of those compliance issues as we go through each of the suitable areas. So I'm just going to run through these now in alphabetical order at a high level. The first one we looked at was Chase Village. So this is the Chase Node special area, as well as some high density residential. It really was planned to encourage higher density mixed use and residential development, which is in alignment with the intent of a CFA. But because R3 and R4 are less compliant, which I mentioned, it didn't rank as highly on some of the CFA criteria. Some of our other locations did. This area is primarily developed as student-oriented housing right now, strongly evaluated for access to parks and accessibility via active transportation methods. There's also some planned improvements coming along Martin Luther King Boulevard, which will improve those even further. Next is downtown and kind of the West Campus area. It's a really big location. There's a lot of different zones here. The most predominant are C2 and C3, so those commercial zones, as well as R3 and R4, so higher density residential along the western side of the UO campus. Downtown generally is a great candidate for CFA designation. It's our core commercial area, has a mixture of existing and planned high density uses. But something we'll need to tackle over the next year is the kind of exact boundaries of where we want to designate downtown. The high density housing areas near the UO campus would require more significant changes to existing development standards than kind of the core of downtown would. We did look at three kind of variations of downtown. So the first variation removes the 6th and 7th Avenue corridor out west of Jefferson. Variation B removes the zones with lower levels of compliance with CFA criteria. So that was R3 and R4, so higher density residential, and the Whitaker neighborhood. And then variation C removes both of those areas. So it's our kind of smallest variation, and it mostly encompasses the downtown core, the riverfront, and the adjacent kind of C2 areas. Next, going all the way out west, we have Far West 11th. This is a C2 zoned area. So again, highly compliant in terms of zoning, but some other important considerations for the area. So it's mostly surrounded by industrial and mixed use employment zoned lands. It's not currently well served for parks. It's not currently well served for active transportation, although there is the Fern Ridge path on the northern boundary. And then, of course, West 11th is a major arterial in this section, as is Beltline. So lots of auto-oriented uses and some big box retail specifically in this area. Next is the Ferry Street Bridge area. So this is the Oakway Mall and some of the surrounding commercial district. Again, this is primarily zone C2, highly compliant in terms of zoning. What isn't indicated clearly on this map is there's pretty extensive areas of general office and R3 to the west of this area out towards Valley River Center. And Valley River Center itself is zone C2 as well. So those areas were actually excluded early in the analysis because they are not within a walkable distance of a frequent transit line. Similarly, there's some additional C2 land further up Coburg Road at Crescent Village, and that was also excluded due to existing transit access. Certainly possible that CFAs could be expanded to include those areas, especially if there's plans to extend transit to those areas. Some other considerations for this area, it is primarily a pretty high density mixed use area, but it's surrounded by low density residential. There's good parks access. Coburg Road isn't a great active transportation option, but there have been some improvements in recent years and some additional bike lanes, I think, planned in the area. Franklin Walnut. So this is primarily made up of the Walnut Station special area zone. That's a pretty highly compliant zone for CFAs, but as I mentioned, there's some height regulations that kind of make it variable across the zone. It is planned for mixed uses. We've seen a lot of high density redevelopment in the area recently. There's good parks and public amenities access, and then the planned improvements to Franklin Boulevard will really help with active transportation access here, and it's also already served by the MX. Highway 99 is another kind of predominantly C2 zoned area, transit corridor. Other than the compliant zoning, this area doesn't rank well on our other evaluation criteria. It's not near other mixed use or high density areas. It's surrounded by both industrial and low density residential. It's not well served by parks or public amenities, and it's not well served by active transportation facilities. It's a pretty large cross section, lots of driveways, lots of fast traffic. Santa Clara Station, this map should look pretty familiar. Again, this is mostly C2. There's some general office and neighborhood commercial as well. And as we discussed, the C2 in this area does have a proposed lower height limit that would comply with secondary, but not a primary CFA. It is planned as a high density commercial area, but there's lots of adjacent low density residential, much of which is unincorporated. And it's at the intersection of two major arterials, so not currently well served by safe and comfortable active transportation facilities, although there are plans for protected bike lanes on River Road, a bike lane on Hunsaker, roundabouts on Division, and the extension of the Riverbank Path system, which would all really improve access in this area. CFA designation would align with many of the stated goals of the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan. South Willamette. This is one of our most narrow corridors. So it's separate. It is one of those that meets the suitable definition, but not the kind of optimal definition. Separated from the downtown area just by Amazon Creek. It's zoned similarly for high density and commercial uses. great parks access in this part of town. And when compared to our other transit corridors, it's a narrower cross section, so 3 lanes versus 5. So it's, you know, has seen some of those improvements for walking and biking more recently. And then last but not least, we have our West 11th Avenue suitable CFA. This is our second largest area, actually, after the downtown campus area, but it is bounded to the north by industrial and to the south by lower density residential. There's okay parks access out here right now, but there's planned improvements or development of Mattie Reynolds Park, which will really help access out here. West 11th is a minor arterial shifting into a major arterial in the middle of this corridor. It does have MX service, some north-south bike connections, and the Fern Ridge Path on its southern boundary. So I know this is a lot of information, but taking that all all that analysis, we wanted to provide at least some way to kind of rank the areas against each other. So we took 6 of the criteria that are in the rules and ranked kind of the top 3 areas by criterion. There are certainly other considerations that are not necessarily noted here. When we look at development regulation compliance, again, those areas that are dominated, by C2 and have fewer of those overlay zones ranked higher. So that's the Ferry Street Bridge area, Highway 99, and then downtown campus, the variation that kind of removed the zones of less compliance. Looking at dwelling unit capacity, so again, we're required to designate enough acres as CFAs to meet 30% of our current and future housing needs. This is just estimating the zoned capacity with no consideration of what's on the ground today. So really just looking at size, of course, downtown campus is our largest area, followed by West 11th and Highway 99. And looking at kind of mixed use areas or density, several of the CFAs are existing or planned as mixed use areas, including downtown, the Ferry Street Bridge area, and Franklin kind of Walnut Station area. These areas also have fewer kind of adjacency to low density residential or industrial zones. Parks and amenities. Most of our areas have adequate parks and amenities access, but downtown, South Willamette, and again, Walnut Station stand out. In terms of active transportation, downtown Eugene and the areas kind of adjacent to UO generally feature high quality active transportation facilities, and with scheduled improvements to Franklin Boulevard, Franklin Walnut also kind of rises to the top. South Willamette has also seen recent improvements and is a smaller cross-section compared to the other transit corridors. Finally, looking at development and redevelopment conditions. So housing downtown is a big priority for the city, as is expressed through our downtown plan, urban renewal planning. But there's also some areas with some potential. So Santa Clara Station has some existing vacant and partially vacant areas, including the LTD surplus site up there. And West 11th has some undeveloped areas within and adjacent to its CFA boundaries. This is a super high level look at redevelopment conditions. So we're going to dig deeper into that during an upcoming redevelopment analysis, which I'll talk more about in our next steps. Okay, so the last piece of our analysis is in the CFA study was the anti-displacement analysis. We use that to explore housing displacement risk, both citywide and in our climate-friendly areas. We conducted this analysis as kind of a parallel effort with the more technical analysis we just reviewed. These results are really intended to provide context, but not necessarily to rank the CFAs against each other. DLCD, so the state provided a suggested approach for the analysis, which the city and Lane Council of Governments kind of modified slightly. LCOG did that analysis, really looking to identify the distribution of housing inequities by investigating disparities in people, housing, and place. So the analysis uses 5 key questions related to area demographics and housing market conditions to differentiate areas based on displacement risk. So where do people with lower incomes live? Where do communities of color and other people who are vulnerable to displacement live? Where is their older or multi-unit housing located? Where is the housing market kind of hot or more active? And have there been any significant changes in the area characteristics that could signify ongoing displacement? So the analysis categorizes areas of the city into 6 different types that are kind of a combination of yes or no questions to those, yes or no answers to those 5 questions. These types describe the relative displacement risk in that part of the city when compared to the city as a whole. So it's not compared to the state, it's not compared to the region or other geographies. Essentially, these area types are identified by overlaying where people who are vulnerable to housing displacement live with our housing development patterns. So the first 3 area types, vulnerable, early gentrification, and active gentrification, are designated as low income compared to the city as a whole. And they have more vulnerable people and either more older or multi-unit housing stock. So areas kind of under that earlier active gentrification tend to have a more active housing market, and active gentrification indicates some ongoing changes in the demographics of the area. The next 3 area types on the table are designated as high income. So they have relatively hot housing markets as indicated by higher rents and higher home values compared to the city as a whole. And they do not have relatively higher amounts of older or multi-unit housing. The first type, late gentrification, still has vulnerable people and experiences gentrification-related demographic changes. The last 2 area types indicate kind of the more exclusive or affluent areas compared to the city as a whole. Many areas do not fit into any of those types. So there's either not a notable pattern in the years that we looked at, or they just didn't quite perfectly fit one of those types, and those are considered unassigned within the analysis. So this is kind of the map that shows the results of the risk analysis overlaid with our suitable CFAs. So approximately 1/3 of the acres within our CFAs were considered vulnerable, which are those areas in dark purple. About 18% are in early gentrification, which is a slightly lighter purple, and then 11% were in that active gentrification, so the lightest purple. About 35% of acres within suitable CFAs were unassigned under the kind of displacement risk typology. Also say it's not that surprising, thinking through the methodology, that none of our suitable CFAs are considered in one of those more exclusive area types, because the typology feature considers existing housing stock. So all of those areas have a higher percentage of newer homes or single unit homes when compared to the city as a whole. And because we already excluded low density residential areas, a lot of the areas kind of on the fringe of the urban area, the CFA study really first looked at places where we see multi-unit housing or more in the core, right? So not that surprising that we didn't see those types in our analysis. It's also important to note that these area types are just one tool to help provide a basis for informed decisions in housing and land use planning going forward. So the results don't mean that a certain area cannot be designated as a CFA, just means we need to be deliberate and thoughtful, especially in our community engagement in introducing strategies to avoid or reduce displacement. So there are other tools and programs that the city will continue to develop as the CFAC work progresses. They could be introduced in tandem with CFA designation to provide support for vulnerable community members, to preserve existing affordable housing stock, or to increase income qualified affordable housing in those areas. Almost done here. So just a couple of additional caveats. So I think it's just important to note, as we were going through this process, that big picture, Eugene is kind of struggling with housing affordability and availability citywide. So to say that some areas of the city are still affordable compared to others felt a little off, to staff when we were going through this. And we also know that people are vulnerable to housing displacement for many different reasons, limited incomes, systemic racism, many more. And just because an area is identified as vulnerable or in early gentrification and another area is stable doesn't mean that there aren't people living in those areas that are not vulnerable to displacement themselves. So an important thing to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, we'll kind of continue pursuing strategies citywide through our upcoming work to protect those vulnerable community members from displacement. In terms of the methodology, this this approach really relies on some outdated American Community Survey data at the block group level, which can be a little bit unreliable to draw conclusions to, really dynamic local housing needs, especially post-COVID, when a lot of those dynamics have changed. And after discussions with folks in the field about whether we could tweak this methodology or make improvements to it, we found that, any typology is kind of going to be imperfect. Trying to put, neighborhoods into or specific areas into a box is going to be complex, and measuring displacement and gentrification itself is complex. So we know that spatial data alone cannot tell us exactly what we need to know about displacement risk, but we'll really need to think through this in terms of our community engagement. So all that to say, I don't want to diminish the importance of looking at displacement risk when we're considering making zoning or regulatory changes to an area. But we want to be realistic about how we can use this information to kind of inform our policy decisions moving forward. Which is a great transition to our last section on next steps. So just talking through a little bit of how this will unfold. As we've mentioned, the designation of climate-friendly areas is getting folded into our urban growth strategies project, which we've given you all a bit of an intro to at this point. There are a few specific points of integration I wanted to call out. So our housing production strategy is one of the things we'll be working on this year. It'll identify and prioritize tools, actions, and policies to provide housing that's affordable to all. So this strategy document will include climate-friendly areas designation and any associated kind of anti-displacement mitigation strategies we might want to pursue. Climate-friendly areas designation really is one tool in our toolbox for more compact development within the UGB. So the exciting kind of work of the Urban Growth Strategies Project will be considering all of our tools together and determining which to apply in which areas to really advance our vision and the unique needs of the community. Those policy measures to more efficiently develop land within the UGB, a land use efficiency measure. Those policy measures are called land use efficiency measures. CFA designation is a mixed use development tool, so it will serve as both a residential and an employment efficiency measure. We will be coming back to Planning Commission in the late summer with the results of a redevelopment analysis, which will be focused on the climate-friendly areas. And this redevelopment analysis will explore the potential for increased development or redevelopment from CFA designation, and maybe what other incentives we might want to introduce in tandem. At a policy level, CFAs will also be implemented through the comprehensive plan. So as a part of that phase 2 work, we expect to include some CFA relevant policies in our housing, compact development, and community health chapters, as well as actually a map designating those climate-friendly areas. And then finally, as I mentioned, our community engagement plan for the Urban Growth Strategies Project includes coordinated strategies to support CFA selection. So we'll be coming back to you all in February to review that plan. So here's the general timeline for our next steps. As I mentioned, we'll be coming back to you through a few different work sessions that'll touch on CFAs, including updates on the housing production strategy, community engagement plan, and the redevelopment analysis. We'll ask you all for a recommendation on CFAs in the fall in order to get a decision from City Council by the end of the year. And in 2025, we'll work through the necessary amendments and additions to the land use code and the comprehensive plan. There are several ways this designation could be implemented. It could be through a designation overlay zone like we have for nodal development. Could be through amendments to existing zones or something else. So we won't completely be able to decide on that until we have a better sense of the direction that we'll take through conversations with the community and with you all and with City Council. We're required to adopt our climate-friendly areas by the end of 2026. And so that'll be a component of that larger urban growth strategies adoption package. So with that, I'm gonna take a sip of water. I will be ready for your questions.
Wow. I have one question, but if anyone else wants to jump in first, I'm happy to. Thank you, Leah. That was very good. And you had my full attention the entire, I'm not kidding. It was like riveting. Maybe something's wrong with me. I don't know. my question was about what does the state require of us in by way of like how, we've identified all these climate friendly areas, but my understanding is that we have to designate a certain percentage or whatnot.
Yeah.
What's the requirement? And then what can we do above and beyond that?
So the requirement is that 30% of existing and future housing needs. So we need to designate enough acres to accommodate that many units, which off the top of my head, and Heather might know, is like 15,000. No, I don't want to guess at it. I can come back to you. Yeah.
And is it
I'm sorry.
consolidated though? I mean, even in an area like downtown, for example, my memory is not great when it comes to having seen some of where we have buildable lands inventory, but to me, it seemed like it was pretty dispersed. And so to say we can accomplish it all by just downtown and this West 11th kind of thing, it would maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just like kind of thinking about it that way. It's like the capacity might not cover it all. I don't know.
So the state is only going to require us to look at that zoned capacity, which doesn't consider what's on the ground, doesn't consider like realistic redevelopment conditions. We would like to use it, we plan to use it as a land use efficiency measure, which is one of the tools we need to introduce before we can look at our overall urban growth boundary. So in order to use it as a land use efficiency measure, we need to be able to point to how many units we think realistically can be produced here. So we will be using that redevelopment analysis to help us to get a more realistic estimate. So when we come back, that's something we'll be working on this summer. And so we'll come back to you all at the end of the summer with the results of that, of like, here's what we realistically think we can get redeveloped out of these CFAs. One, just based purely on the zoning changes, which are not huge, as I mentioned, in a lot of these areas. And are there maybe some incentives we can introduce side by side with the zoning change to increase the number of expected units we would see from the designation?
Okay. Commissioner Lear, I think you.
Yeah, I had kind of a tag-on question to that. So it sounds like we have to at least adopt one primary CFA. But I was kind of wondering, is there anything in the state law or does staff have any view on is there a reason we shouldn't make them all primary versus secondary, or what's the balance there?
It's a good question. And I think we have a lot of flexibility in that. There might be areas that are not quite ripe for primary designation. Maybe the height changes or the minimum density would not serve the housing production goals in that area. So that's something we definitely want to explore through the redevelopment analysis, is that minimum residential density. We don't want it to get in the way of good housing production. So that could be a reason that we'd want to designate an area that's as a secondary and say, let's wait and see how conditions change. And then the next time we do the UGB analysis in 8 years, we could up it to a primary, something like that. So there's a lot of flexibility in how we use that.
Okay.
I would add on to that a little bit, which is, as we all know, the CFA program and designation is a pretty new tool, but we've been talking about compact development for a very long time in Eugene, and we have adopted plans that call for this kind of development in many areas around our city. Meanwhile, we're starting this comprehensive look at our entire city and completing major portions of our comprehensive plan. So part of the conversations we'll be having with you all and with the community is, where can CFAs meet the requirements and also help us get towards our citywide goals? Because there may be other tools that we want to use in different places, and we don't know the answer to that yet. But I think it's a great question, because everything's on the table at this point.
And maybe just a tag-on comment as well, that it's really interesting because it seems like a really powerful tool to promote compact development. And do do you go for kind of the more obvious area like downtown, which probably already has much more overlap with those development opportunities, or use it more aspirationally, look at areas that don't have those features or characteristics, but which could benefit from them, you know, significantly by increasing density in those areas.
Yep. Commissioner Bailing, go ahead, and then I'll call on you, Chris.
First, Leah, I have to tell you, I'm in awe of the amount of work that went into producing this and the work that you've done the last couple of years. Having worked on major area plans at university in California, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe she did this. So thank you. And I'm glad we have the whole year to kind of get our heads around this. I read through everything twice and I still feel like I'm needing to learn a foreign language. And so a lot of my questions are I didn't think they're nuances, they're just things I really would like to understand better. So there's some assumption made, and I don't know if I'm making the right assumption, that a CFA designation will trigger risk of housing displacement. And I'd like to understand why. Is it because you're assuming there will be redevelopment? We're assuming it's going to increase property values? What actually in a CFA designation triggers risk of displacement?
That's a great question. I don't think that CFA designation is necessarily different from other tools that encourage redevelopment and like what we call upzoning, right? So any new redevelopment is going to tend to be more expensive unless it's income qualified than some of the older, maybe kind of naturally occurring housing that's already there. It might be more dense, it's increasing the number of units we have, but in our city that is primarily developed, right, in these more core areas, we don't have lots of vacant land where we'll have new development, it's kind of redeveloping what's already there. So assuming that it's taking the place of something. So yes, I think you're spot on in kind of why. I don't think CFA designation is different than other forms of redevelopment or upzoning, but as a part of this climate friendly and equitable communities, the state really wanted to make sure that cities were considering those impacts in making kind of geographically specific changes.
Thank you. Okay. One of my other assumptions, we're talking about climate friendly and being able to meet your needs without a car. It's like, to me, that translates to walkable neighborhoods. And I'm sorry to see places like Crescent Village and Delta Oaks and stuff eliminated because they're already providing most everything a person needs, where even if you had to drive there, you could then walk in everything, including doctor's office and the supermarket and the pharmacy and the cleaners and the post office. And so doesn't that, to me, it makes sense that we should be including those areas that are already climate friendly or effective walkable neighborhoods. And if the one thing keeping them out is the lack of bus service, can that be included in future planning so that?
It's a great point, and I probably didn't state clearly enough that the areas we looked at in the study are not the only areas that we can consider designating as climate friendly areas. So we hear from you all, from the public, that they want other areas to be considered, that they see in alignment with Crescent Village or Delta Oaks or wherever it might be, with this CFA designation, we can certainly pull them in. So nothing is permanently ruled out by any means. We had to narrow in some way, and frequent transit access was a good way to do that. But we noticed pretty quickly that some of our areas where there have been previous efforts to increase the compact kind of walkable development were excluded early on. So we welcome that feedback if there's areas that you all think we should bring back into the discussion.
Well, I think those should be in, I mean, personally, because to me, it's like a no-brainer that they're already walkable neighborhoods, and like Crescent Village even has some pretty good density of housing. Okay, I didn't understand the elimination of the Barger Echo Hollow area. Something about it not having the width, but
Yeah.
I'm sure from Barger to the back of Winco is more than 750 feet, so I don't
Yeah.
understand.
In the analysis, that in terms of its current zoning, that area was not 750 feet wide kind of throughout. That doesn't mean that we can't pick it back up and look at, adjacent parcels that have different zoning and, upzone it. There's those things are on the table. Something that we've also talked about and Terry mentioned is that CFAs won't be the only tool that we're looking at as a part of urban growth strategies. So it's possible that in Bethel or in that specific area, there's another tool that we want to introduce that maybe isn't CFA designation, but is something else that gets us to like increasing density out there, increasing commercial development, whatever it might be. But I think it's a great point.
Okay, because, you talked about these being spread out, but, there's a marked absence in Bethel and in North Eugene. And I really would like to see it more widespread. We're begging for amenities out in Bethel. And there's plenty of places, they could go in if we found the right developers, but that's beside the point. But I would like to see it even more distributed.
Yeah.
More inclusive that way. And for my own understanding, your references to active transportation, that refers only to walking and biking, not, that term is used throughout, and I kept thinking transportation is active, but.
It's primarily walking and biking infrastructure. I would say I lumped in a little bit of transit in there as well. And improvements to car facilities that make it safer for people walking or biking. So when we're making improvements on Coburg Road to, reduce the driveways, that is something that makes it safer for all road users, including people walking.
And how were your boundaries of the different sections determined? Because some of them squiggled all around.
It was both by the existing zoning and by that walkable distance from frequent transit. So that's why you got some of the really weird shapes where there might be a bus stop and then, half-mile walking from that, and that's where it kind of ends. So one of the next steps we'll need to take is to actually go in and draw the boundaries in a way that feels maybe a little bit more logical. And because this is just in GIS mapping analysis right now.
Maybe while we're discussing, we could flip back to slide 14. It shows the map of suitable CFA.
Sorry, just ignore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes. That's what you're looking at.
What are census block groups?
So they are a unit of how the census collects data. So census tracts are the bigger version and block groups are within tracts. So they're smaller, more granular.
Okay. I think we just about got it. We talked about the areas. And I admit to being very confused about the requirement of the 30% for dwelling unit capacity, but we're not considering actual buildable land. I mean, that just makes no sense to me. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's theoretical capacity, basically.
But we do have an actual need.
Yeah. So as we finish this state required program, we're also completing our council-directed policy work,
Mhm.
which is combined with state mandates to look at our UGB for housing for the next 8 years, or every 8 years. So we're doing a lot of integrating, as Leah pointed out, and a lot of coordination between various state mandates and our long-established kind of policy goals. It's a great point. We don't just want to plan for theoretical capacity. We want to meet the letter of the requirements and in service of our larger goals as a community. So point well taken.
Thanks.
We need to do both.
And my last thing is, on page 10 of your study, that footnote at the bottom about all the marginalized
Oh, yeah.
groups,
Mhm.
I read through it several times, and it seems to me the only group not listed is middle-aged, wealthy, white.
That list comes.
Every other ethnicity, skin tone, origin, the city of Eugene actually considers everything non-white as marginalized?
So that list comes from the state, and it's specifically called out actually in the administrative rules for CFEC. We added to it students and veterans for Eugene, given our kind of specific context. But yeah, the state comes from.
Youth and seniors even. I mean, it's like,
I think the intent is to call out different identities and folks who may not always participate or may have unique needs as compared to each other. And not to say that like middle-aged white folks don't have needs for housing as well. But just to be really explicit and encourage and require that cities are being intentional about how they're engaging and how they're doing that outreach.
well, not to beg the point, but it seems to me easily more than half of the population, even the white population, may have some disability or some challenge or some mobility issue, or you're probably talking about a huge percentage of the population.
We'll be able to get into this a lot more deeply at our next meeting, because we're going to be going over the community engagement plan and the strategies that we'll be looking to use to do targeted outreach with specific groups that are on the state's list,
Right.
as well as more general tools that we use to reach the broader population. So looking forward to getting into that.
Thank you. I've taken up everybody's time enough.
No worries. Thank you, guys. I'm going to move to Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you. I'm going to go back. The first thing that occurred to me is something that the two of you, Commissioner Edwards and Lear, brought up, which is generally, how do we know when we're done? What is the criteria by which we push back from the table and say, okay, we're satisfied, we did our job? And what I heard you say was it's 30% of the projected housing need and counting, including currently unmet and then future need, right?
Current and future housing units, yep.
So on the top of, and my numbers are page 32 maybe, but anyway, here it says 30% of current and future housing needs constitutes a total of 25,637 units. So I heard a couple different numbers here. So
Yeah.
that's 30% of the need, or that's the entire need?
That is 30% of not only our current number of housing units on the ground, plus our adopted need,
Okay.
which is 15,000 units, which comes from our 2012 UGB. So it's current units on the ground plus 15,000, making 30% of that is how,
And that's this number.
yes.
Thank you. Then the state says, well, that's our criteria. So we could just find that, circle downtown and wow, wipe our hands, we're done.
Hmm.
And in the process, we will have saved an enormous amount of staff time, an enormous amount of volunteer time and angst and political capital throughout the community. But that may not be the best thing to do. So my question to you is, how do we know when we're done? Could we say, change that number? I think 30 is low. Could we change it to 40 and say, okay, we want it, you know, yeah, state, we met your goal of 30 and we went to 40. And I think it would be really important to either way to explain this to the public, that this is what, okay, this is how we did it. Because the other way we did it, you did it, was to just say, well, here's the top 3 performers. And that maybe that's okay too. We just take, well, these are our best 3 spots after we got done. And it does include 30%, so we're done. So I don't know how we set that number as we go forward, but it would be nice to have a number. And I think we'd all support a point to say, well, can we even be better? Because 30% doesn't seem like a lot to me.
Yeah.
If that's the kind of community we're going to be in the future, maybe that's not enough.
I think that you're pointing to one reason we're excited to move CFAs into this larger urban growth planning work, because we do want to use CFAs as, again, one of our efficiency measures that demonstrate that we are working to grow more compactly before we need to grow out in terms of the UGB.
Yeah.
So we will need to say, realistically, we expect this many units to come out of CFA designation in order to justify it as an efficiency measure.
That's the low bar.
And so that's not just the theoretical capacity, right? That's kind of the real capacity that we expect out of it. So we could say, you know, we expect this truly to accommodate 10% or 20% or whatever that number is, based on real numbers versus just increasing that kind of theoretical capacity bar.
Right.
That's certainly something I think we'll have to tackle when we do the redevelopment analysis and start looking at all of our land use efficiency measures.
And I would say that was more than you can say in an elevator. So however we're going to explain it to people, what is it? Okay, we met the state standard and then we went a little further because their standard wasn't realistic in terms of redevelopment. However you were going to get to that, I think otherwise it's just numbers on numbers and nobody knows where we're going.
It's a great point. Sorry, were you done?
Yes.
I just didn't want to interrupt you. But I wanted to add that there are the numbers that we need to complete for the UGB analysis. And there's also a lot of policy work that, as a long range planner, I look at the work that's coming up on our comprehensive plan and the goals that we have around, say, walkable neighborhoods, like Diane brought up. If we have a goal in our comprehensive plan that says 90% or whatever, some number of residents live within walking distance of a neighborhood center, something like that. That's another way to get to a decision that would potentially have different implementation measures. So I think that there's a lot of different tools and different ways that we could be looking at that. But 2 most immediate ones are CFA requirements and UGB requirements. We also have a lot of policy reasons that could lead to other planning actions.
Yeah. And I think kind of where I started was, I don't want to spend a lot of our time or staff time or political capital if we don't think it's a wise decision to do that. So it's like, what's the best practices, but let's not get so far into the weeds that we, spend 3 years and get the minimum at the end. I don't know how we have to figure that out. But.
I have a comment to your point, and it hadn't really occurred to me, but I wholeheartedly agree. But in thinking about the work that's gone in to identify these areas, I serve on the ETAC as well. And so we spent a lot of time looking at areas outside the UGB where to go. And it was incredibly difficult to identify areas where we could actually feasibly grow. And so, a lot of time and effort went into that and identified, and that's where the urban reserves process came from. But then within the UGB, this process that you all have started to identify where the opportunities are within it, I think it feels like it would be a waste of time and effort to not do something because, the next phase beyond this is then those policy, the incentives and the other things that we do to ensure that, okay, we've decided as a community, this is where we have to grow and this is where it's feasible to do so. And so putting in place all of the different levers that we can pull to ensure that we're moving that forward, because so many other things are impacted by that. The way that we plan for our transit and the way that we plan for housing and services and all that other thing, I think it's all really interconnected and tied. And to me, it seems like we should be doing something with this information beyond just saying, look at the pretty colors. So I agree with you. I think, and to go beyond just this map and, because you had identified these other areas that weren't suitable based on their size being less than 750 feet or whatever it was, but there's still areas that kind of rose to something, whether, even though they're not CFEC compliant. I think that the other thing I want to mention is that part of the reason that I was really struggling to support the neighborhood zoning changes in the River Road Santa Clara area was specifically that parcel. And I know that has so much potential. And I wonder if there was any way, because I know there's also C2 further down the corridor that probably is more invasive to, adjacent to low density residential. But that swath of property right there that is all really, if you're familiar with it, it's the Hunsaker property that LTD is surplus. There's a Walgreens, there's just a lot of redevelopment opportunity. And so I would wonder if there was a way to, through this process, identify that area as, I don't want to say restoring height or anything like that, but having different provisions apply to that specific as a next phase. And obviously, but it would be something that could be a consideration.
And that's something we talked about through the code amendments process, is making sure we weren't taking the climate friendly area designation off the table for that area before we had even gone through it. So it would still, with the proposed height changes, would still qualify as a secondary CFA.
Yeah.
So again, that could be something where it's a secondary CFA now, and that sets it up as development conditions change in the future. In 8 years, we could, increase it to a primary, something like that.
Sure. Okay.
To your point, it is in alignment with the, I think with the goals of the River Road Santa Clara neighborhood plan to see more of that mixed use walkable development in that area.
Okay. Anybody else? Commissioner Isaacson, I don't want to forget about you up there on the screen.
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Beeson, go ahead. Okay. And then I'll go back to Commissioner Lear, but go ahead and jump in, Commissioner Beeson.
Okay, I'm going to try to be pretty limited. First off, I would echo Commissioner Bailing. This is a very impressive piece of work. There is a lot here. I told Heather before the meeting, this is some sort of almost paradise for wonks. And it's very interesting. I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about, maybe what I'll do is the idea of the CFAs and I'm sort of thinking from the top down in a way when I look. Well, I also want to say very briefly, I think on a start of a multi-year process like this, on something this complex, commissioners ought to get a little bit of license for vagueness, until we sort of clarify our thoughts, and maybe that's just me. When I think about everything that's been going on the last number of years, as I've learned about it, I think our population's clearly going to grow. I think the UGB ultimately is going to expand. I think it's incumbent on the community that we, in these particular urban areas, that we look to and figure out how to develop them as efficiently as we can. This whole thing from the state offers us a kind of a structure to help you know, kind of facilitate that and inform that. So I find myself thinking so the idea of whether we limit it or not, or how we do that, or how we look at it, I'm also kind of thinking, as you determine what these are and you get them set, we go through this process over the next year or so, we get to the point where then the council, we've got a certain amount and we've reached the 25,000 unit capacity, whatever that is, however that gets defined. And we come up with 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever it is. It seems like we're, you know, once we've kind of done that, there's not necessarily any additional cost to the city or to the municipality, I don't think. You've set the standards and the regulations are in there. You've adjusted the zones or you've adjusted the land use code. The development is going to happen by virtue of people who want to go do development for whatever various reasons people do that, and are trying to do it in a way that allows us to use everything efficiently. And it's almost like you sort of set the table for it, and we're trying to see that our urban areas, these urban zones, are developed efficiently, and we're making the most efficient use of our facilities and so on. So
Yes, and I would just add, there are some requirements that I didn't talk about today of what the implication of
Okay.
what a CFA designation is, other than the changing in the development regulations. So there are some specific transportation planning requirements that'll come out of that designation. They'll need to do, once we designate those areas, we'll need to do a multimodal gap analysis. So basically, what are the gaps in the walking and biking and transit network in those areas? And we'll be required to do some prioritization of those investments in those areas to fill those gaps over time. So there will be some investment expected from the city in filling those gaps. There is potentially the displacement mitigation measures. So we could say, you know, we want to introduce XYZ investments, whether that be, you know, more income qualified affordable housing in these areas or other ways to kind of preserve and protect vulnerable residents. That'll come out of our kind of housing production strategy work and remains undetermined today what that will be. And we might say, we know that tweaking the zoning isn't enough to see meaningful redevelopment in these areas alone. So we want to introduce a tax exemption or some other incentive in these areas. So I would just say, yes, the zoning changes don't cost us a lot, but those other things to actually see the changes that the CFA designation looks to achieve potentially do.
Okay. One of the things to explore just a little bit, I guess I don't want to go too far in it, but I found myself struggling a bit with the primary CFA designation. As I went through everything, it was being applied to things like density or building height or some of the criteria. And as you go through the narrowing process, and you'd say, well, and so and just to use Santa Clara Station as an example, because it's kind of fresh in my mind. The building height, so if I have this right, the building height, if it was remaining at 120, that would not preclude it from being a primary CFA.
If it primary CFA, the max height would be less than 85.
85, yeah. So when they go down to 65, it doesn't drop below the 50 number. So say it's still okay, because but it's a secondary CFA. So where it's taking me is, and then this applies to like density and building height and so on. You spread it across, and you're looking at it in each of these 9 areas you're examining. I found myself wondering, and so if for some reason, let's say the building height was 45 feet, then it would not, a particular area like that just would not meet the minimum requirements from the state and so on and to be considered as a CFA?
In order to designate it, we would need to change that
Okay.
maximum height.
Well, so that's kind of where I was headed. So in the case of any of these criteria, whatever they all are, if we look at an area and say, you know, this is going to be this is a pretty good candidate to be a CFA. But in a couple of these dimensions, we then would need to go in, and that's where the land use code and or plan adjustments would take place.
Yeah, exactly.
So some of them that might look pretty good coming out of the blocks are ones where we might have less of that in front.
Yes.
That's kind of an obvious.
Yeah, so some of the ones that ranked higher are, and the ones we narrowed to from the get-go are where there's already some level of compliance with that, like higher or medium density mixed uses. Yes, so when I say C2 and C3 kind of rank better, it's based on compliance. The difference between the current development standards in those zones and the requirements of CFAs, the daylight between them is smaller.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's obviously I mean, it seems like there's a pretty clear alignment between how all of this begins to fall out in our C2 zone, which I think makes sense the way C2 is defined and what's allowed. Okay, I've got more at some point in the future, but that will.
Okay, Commissioner
Thank
O'Meara,
you.
I'm going to let you get, and I'm going to try to keep us on. You're good.
Yeah. I was just curious, and some of these comments that I had in mind were very similar to what Commissioner Beeson was mentioning, or another side of that issue. You were mentioning that there may be certain city expenditures required or that are advisable for CFAs. And I'm wondering if you might anticipate other development or financial incentives that come from the state, like state funding for CFAs for certain types of development. Is that contemplated at all within the current legislation, or do you foresee that as a possibility in the future?
We can hope.
He's dreaming.
The state DLCD, I think, hopes and intends to give local governments more money to implement this work, whether or not that is, given to them by the legislature in the 2020, the next biennium, remains to be seen. There is funding on the table to do this work through the 2023 to 2025 biennium, our current biennium, but after that.
And it's largely planning money.
Sure.
So we're implementing and updating our regulations, but incentives or money to build housing, I think is going to come out of the housing program. And transportation funds would come from transportation sources.
Yeah, ODOT is a partner in the CFAC rules, so they have given some funding to, transportation planning folks to do some of the other transportation related components of CFAC.
Thanks for flagging that the Santa Clara could still be a secondary even while maintaining the building height. That poor Santa Clara community, it seems like all of their plans, are getting whiplashed around so quickly by all these new state rules. That was a close vote, and I would hope that we would not deprioritize the area just because of the building height issue, if it seems like it would benefit the community and the goals there overall. The other item I just wanted to touch on quickly was, I was kind of confused by the anti-displacement analysis. I know you alluded to this in your presentation as well, that was I understanding you correctly that we don't have to consider it? It almost seemed kind of contradictory, like looking at the map and the vulnerable communities versus the areas that seem to be the best candidates for CFAs. And like that coffee shop example in there kind of confused me a little bit more, because I just don't even see the connection between like a decent coffee shop and how that would cause consternation in a community or something. So maybe you just touch on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so we are required to do the displacement risk analysis as a part of the study. And we will be required, when we designate climate friendly areas, to look at what are some of the strategies we could use to mitigate displacement risk. There's no requirement that we can't designate an area as a CFA because it comes up as vulnerable or in early gentrification. but really is just a poke at us to think about it thoughtfully and talk about it in community engagement and really making sure that we're being sensitive to how much we change development regulations in areas that are lower income and potentially have more vulnerable residents without really thinking through those implications. The coffee shop example in the study is really more about language of people are more familiar with the term of gentrification, but we're really talking about displacement, which is actually people not being able to afford to stay in their homes. And so trying to clarify between the two terms.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Ramey,
Sorry.
watching my watch.
I only got through one. I'm gonna circle back on that one thing because I think I'm trying to get my hands around, well, why would we want to have more than we're required to have? Because it allows us to develop in a way we want to develop and use these new tools to do that. The flip side of that is that's costly to go through all the changes, the transportation analysis and all that. So I begin to see a way to weigh these to say, okay, maybe we should do more, maybe we should find the middle ground here, because if we do all of them, we'll be here forever. So there's got to be some way to talk about this, and this is what we get, and this is how much it costs to get there, and how much of that do we want to spend to get there? It's not going to be easy in a lot of these places. So that leads my second new point, which is about nodal development. And if we could have some kind of analysis at some point that overlays the nodal things in the city, and we can see which ones works and which ones don't, or even where they are. Walnut Station is a node, but I don't know if we would call that successful or not. I'm only familiar with that one, but I know there was a time in the city, several decades, where that was the idea. We're going to have these nodes. And the pushback that came from that idea was pretty severe. Now, let me give you a couple examples. Upzoning. If you're a planner and you go into it and you draw a circle around, and we can walk from here, well, some of the places you're going to draw around are R1 zones. 100% of people who live in R1 zones do not want to get upzoned, right? Because that's their neighborhood. And that's the pushback that happened that I was aware of in the first round of nodes. Is that you weren't, so then it all had to drop back to R3, R4. And then the second issue is transitions. That's why in Walnut Station, there's 50, 60 foot in some places because it's next to R1. That's why in South University area, some of those are depressed heights because they're next to R1. That's why on the Willamette Street corridor, you're going to have the same issues. You're going to have tall buildings next to small buildings. And that is a very difficult problem to solve. So what the solution that happened in Walnut Station, we just step back. We make the transition not in R1, we make the transition in C2. And that's how that happened. So when we talk about going to Walnut Station and changing all of those heights to 85, that is going to be a hard conversation with anybody who remembers why they weren't 85 to begin with. So that would be what lessons can we learn from the nodal development? What worked, what didn't, and how can we build on that as we go forward? And then finally, I get to geek out here on page 55. There's an example of the little red dots, and that's the Riverfront District. Can you bring up that page? I think it's 55 of, I'm trying to remember how these are numbered.
You're looking at the packet, right?
55, yeah, in our
Packet
packet.
or the study?
No, of our packet.
Oh.
So it's page 55 up 136. Oh, you don't have oh, sorry.
Okay.
Oh, I might get in trouble.
It is the map of recent permits in, do you remember what CFA it's in?
Oh, that's building permit activity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I misunderstood. I'm glad we had this conversation.
Yeah, so the
So
maps.
these are not projected units.
No.
These are, okay.
So I don't know
where-
which CFA you're looking at.
It doesn't
but as
matter.
an
Now,
example,
you just answered all my questions. Right?
This is permits in the last 10
Right,
years. And the red dots are
This is not potential. This
Unit,
is
single unit.
what we've done in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so there isn't an equivalent to this that says where the potential is.
No.
Yet, but there
Not
will
yet.
be.
We're going to do a redevelopment analysis this summer.
That's where we might find that.
And we will be focusing on the climate friendly areas. There will be some other areas we look at too, to help us understand really what we can expect. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I don't know if it will be a dot,
No.
but this is growth monitoring data. But yeah, there will be some sort of map,
Right.
But redevelopment are not actually required by the state map, so I don't know what that is going to look like. But there will be.
Right, yeah, well, so the only other thing I had, was about the vulnerability exercise, and if there's any way, and it doesn't sound like there is, or that it would be useful to sort of scale that down to like literally block by block and say, oh, can we get to block by block? And in way you'd be reverse redlining. You'd be lining places that are not vulnerable and leaving places that are vulnerable, which is the opposite of how we got where we are.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we can get this data to that scale. But
Yeah, I mean, even getting it to the block group scale is fraught with margins of error and issues in the data. So I think getting it through community engagement is certainly a way we could get a little bit deeper and more nuanced. I think your point around actually focusing on affluent areas, right? And like kind of reversing the
I did not say that.
but thinking through kind of the opposite of where are the vulnerable areas, where are the less vulnerable areas, and considering that is a good one.
Okay. Good with all the questions on this topic. Sorry, you guys, I just want to try to keep us on track, and I apologize because we're getting right up to the time. But with that, I think I want to move it to see if Alyssa has any items from staff. And I do have a question for you as you're filling us in.
Okay.
Middle housing public hearing. Do we?
That is on my
Okay.
list. Yeah,
Thank you.
I will get to that. I'm going to start with planning commission meetings first. So as Leah mentioned, your next one is February 13th, and that is going to be reviewing the community engagement plan for the Urban Growth Strategies project. That will be a hybrid meeting, so hope to see you here. Your second meeting in February is on the 27th, and I'll email this out this week, but that will be a fair housing training that will be completely virtual. We're going to give you a spring break and cancel the March meetings. Not only do we have conflicts with both meeting dates, but we don't actually have a timely topic, so it works out for all of us. So enjoy your couple of free nights that month. In April, the regular meeting dates actually both conflict with some religious holidays. So we're going to send out a poll for some alternative dates. We've got two topics that month. One is an urban growth strategies update, and then we're hopeful to get the retreat on another date in April. And then for council, February 20th is when the middle housing public hearing has been rescheduled. And just the other council meeting of note would be on March 12th will be the joint public hearing with the Board of Commissioners on the River Road Santa Clara adoption package. So actually that's a good one for you to know as well, Commissioner Edwards.
Which one? Sorry.
So March 12th
Oh,
will be,
that was in their motion.
Motion.
oh, good.
Okay.
Ah,
We added it.
It was in
Perfect.
your
Well,
motion
then-
there, but not in the packet. So I
Right.
thought,
It
did
just
I
got
not
Because
confirm?
we just got confirmation on both of
Today,
those
I believe.
dates. Actually,
Okay.
both dates got
they're
confirmed
both
today.
on my
So
calendar. Yeah.
that's what we have coming up. It's in because of where the Urban Growth Strategies project is so big and we're just really early in that process. So we don't have a lot of meeting dates for you planned out. So it may be a little bit lighter for the next couple of months, but we'll keep you posted on that. We're, figuring out what dates we need for what, but I know sometimes we have periods of a lot of meeting dates. And then we might have a few months of less meeting dates coming up. So
Enjoy it while we can.
yeah, exactly. So that's all I have unless there's any questions for me.
Did
I
you
won't
say
be
you're
here on
gonna
the
have a
13th.
retreat,
February
actually,
13th.
finally?
That's what our plan is. Yeah. What was that?
I will not be here on February 13th.
Okay, good to know.
I won't be here either, but I'll come in remotely.
Okay.
Any other items from other staff or the commissioners? None?
I
Okay.
do have one I want to bring up. So I didn't bring my agenda. I meant to. I think that we should work to, I'm suggesting this, that we should work to have public input at the start of our meetings on a more regular basis. And I say that carefully. I guess I understand there are things that go on and sometimes it's hard to deal with. I was sort of struck by, now this is a hybrid meeting. We also have virtual meetings. When we went to hybrid, or when the state made the requirement, I think coming out of the pandemic, that public agencies offer people the opportunity anyway to connect in virtually. Part of the rationale was, allowing people the continued opportunity to give input. So in brief, I think I would just like us to try to look at it more. It seems to me we do it less. We've been doing it less. We're the citizen involvement group, kind of designated under the state rules. And it just sort of feels like, I also don't think we're really going to be inundated with a lot. I don't know if we are, we can reassess it, but I just would like to bring that up.
No, I really appreciate your comments on that. And we've done a lot of debating about that. There had been a rash of offensive comments
Oh,
showing up
I
at
forgot
public
about that.
involvement, mostly at council, because we didn't have any, but I think it was at council, at the Human Rights Commission. And so we've taken a pause. That's not ideal whatsoever. So we're hopeful to be able to get back to allowing the public comment. And just figuring out a way to be able to monitor and manage that. So your point is well taken, and we actually, I mean, I agree with you that we want to get back to that point. At this point, people can email.
Okay.
So it's not that they can't provide comment, it's just that they can't speak at the meetings. And I know our hybrid meetings, we don't have people come here. We're working on when we do return to the atrium building, the sloat room, which used to be home to the Planning Commission. Some of you have never been in that room. When that remodel is completed, we should be able to actually have people attend work sessions as well.
Okay.
It's just a challenge. That I don't have a date on. I will say that we will lose, so just so you know, we will likely lose access to this room in May because the city manager's office will be moving over to the new city hall. And so it may be we have a period of time where we have just virtual meetings, or we have to bounce over there for a little bit. So it's a work in progress.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. That it then? We did it. All right, I'm going to adjourn us for this evening. Thanks, everybody.